this episode of IH Parts America How To, we will be explaining and showing the procedure on how to take apart your gauges and refurbish them. Now, the purpose of these videos is to show and describe a series of upgrades you can do to your Scout and fixes that you can easily do with common hand tools and parts from IH Parts America. So really, for the gauge restoration slash refurbish, you're only going to need some basic hand tools, you know, a tool roll, whatever you got laying around, basic tool set. And we'll be showing some of the items we may be using today, just kind of depending on the condition we run into when we go to pull it apart. The gauges in this truck all currently work. Really, the only issue is the speedometer gauge lens is a little fogged up, so it's hard to see at night. But since we're taking it apart, we might as well show and explain the whole procedure behind it. So we're going to start with these Phillips screws that surround the physical gauge panel themselves, and in my case there's some custom riggery going on in here, so ignore that. You'll probably have a radio there of some kind. If so, you can just pull the radio knobs off, and that's all you need to do there. So we're going to start by grabbing a number 2 Phillips, and we're going to be removing this panel here. And just like that, the panel should just come right off. Slide it forward, and we are greeted with the gauges, as you see here. And it's very common, you'll see some of this dash expanding and riggery or cutting going on back here. We'll explain why that's there and why someone did that. It's an easily avoidable process to do, so you don't have to cut up your dash. Alright, so now at this point, I'm going to recommend you grab a Sharpie. You'll be using that here momentarily. And it's pretty simple on these gauges. You just gotta unscrew the screws and try not to lose them. And you're gonna pull the gauge out. I'm gonna recommend you have the key off and or battery disconnected. If the key is on and you touch these posts on any metal, it will spark, so word of caution. So at this point, depending on the year of your Scout or D series, you can plug these things in backwards. Cause a whole nightmare that you don't need in wiring, so it's nice just to kind of put some black marker on the top of the connector just so you know how to orientate that when we go to put it back together. So at this point, just repeat the process. You can unplug it for both these 2 gauge pods, and we'll move over to the speedometer here momentarily. Like I mentioned earlier, I just recommend unhooking the battery before anything happens, just to be safe. Reason being why I mainly anticipate people doing it is the fact that on the back of the ammeter we have the ammeter wires, and these are always hot, so if you touch these on the dash they will arc and you may experience sparks if you don't unhook the battery. Highly recommend unhooking the battery to avoid any possible fires or electrical issues. And you'll see here we have 2 nuts that hold these wires on, and we'll tag these with what the wires physically go to, where they go, and correspondence to the posts. So we can do that with some masking tape and just put an L or an R on each of these wires, just so we can't mix that up later. So now we got the plug kind of unplugged, got it marked so we can't mess that up later. Have the wires taped up, R, L, pretty self-explanatory. I would do this if you're not too familiar with how wiring works and where things go, but it's an ammeter, that's all you need to know. So you see here, there's 2 3/8 nuts that hold these wires on. You're gonna wanna put a wrench on the bottom post. Don't try twisting it without having 2 wrenches on there. You will cause damage to the physical gauge, and you'll have to end up spending more money throughout this process. So 2 3/8 wrenches, get these 2 wires off, and then we'll move on to why the speedometer is usually the issue in most of the case, and we'll explain why that hole is there and why someone spread it apart. Alright, now that we got those 2 gauges out of the way, same thing. Usually there are 4 screws for the speedometer. In this case, this one only has 2 of them remaining. Evident that someone was in here at one point. Pull this out and you're gonna realize that it won't come out. And don't pull on it, don't try to rip it out. I will walk over to a Scout that doesn't have this molested, and we'll show you what it looks like when it's not bent out. And people bend this out because they don't unhook the speedometer cable in the back before pulling this out. So let's walk over to a Scout and we'll show you what they look like. All right, we are out in the IH Parts America used truck lot here, and happen to find a Scout. It hasn't had the speedometer removed. The screws are out. Someone must have had the same issues. And you can see there the clearance in between the gauge and the speedometer is very minimal. Very minimal. That's why people pry that apart to try to get the gauge out. And you need to get the speedometer cable out before pulling the speedometer out. That is the number one reason why people break their speedometers. They break the lenses, they bend the dash. So just a precaution when you go to pull that out of your Scout. All right, so you're gonna have to find a way to get your hand in there, possibly with a wrench, depending if the speedometer cable is original. It'll have a hexagonal end on it, and we'll have to get that unthreaded. All right, and after you get that unhooked eventually, the speedometer just kind of falls out. There's this cut, so it comes out even easier. And there you are. There's the back of the Speedo. There's the back of the dash. You got to get to your defrost vents. Now is your time. Now you can kind of see what's going on in the inner workings of the dash area. So we're going to mark the top of this connector, unplug it, and we'll be moving on to the actual restoration of the gauges. All right, now that we got all the gauges out on the tailgate, we will be starting with the speedometer. And the main reason for that was the lens was super fogged up. So we're going to start with the back. Now that just has all the dash gauge light bulb sockets themselves. If these aren't working, now is the time to replace them, or see why they're not working, or replace the bulbs. They just twist out like that. These all worked luckily, so we don't really need to look at them, but pretty evident if they're broken. They'll have broken tabs, or they'll be sticking out of the gauge kind of like that, or the lens will be burnt out in the actual bulb itself. We're getting all those pulled out like so, and now we see that we have the screws to the physical circuit board itself, and that's just a simple slotted or flathead screwdriver, or you can use looks like a 1/4-inch nut driver on that as well. So we're gonna get those removed off of this. 4 simple screws, and we can kind of inspect the circuit board to see if it's restorable. And we can see obviously an animal or something was living in here at one point. You see a lot of debris coming out, and you really just want to inspect the pins. Kind of just want to wiggle them around, make sure they're not loose. If they're loose, you can solder them sometimes. If not, we do offer a brand new circuit board set here at IH Parts America to replace all of them. In this case, this board looks repairable, so we're going to reuse it. And your board probably won't have these blue light bulb covers here. This is kind of a late model Scout 2 thing only. So we'll set that off to the side there. And we are left with the housing and the lens. And an easy way of getting the lenses off, there's these sheet metal tabs here. On this one, there's 5 of them. I use just vertical dice kind of, and there's an easier procedure, but this is what I've found. If you're replacing the lens, because you will kind of nick it up, be the easiest. And sometimes you can get them out without bending them all, but in this case we'll have to undo all of them. Some are more stubborn than others. That one's out. You want to make sure you don't overbend them too, because they are sheet metal and they will break. It's just like that. The lens should just come out. There it goes. So there's the lens removed off the gauge itself. Pretty simple. And then you really don't need to go further than this. If you want to, you can go further in there. There's these cardboard spacers inside the gauge itself. So if you go to unscrew these 2 flathead screws here, this internal speedometer instrument will come out, and then you can access the physical dividers for the lights, and that's what divides the physical indicators inside of here. In our case, we have no reason to really take this apart further, so we'll just kind of clean it off, and then we'll move on to the next gauges. All right, moving on, we got the ammeter / fuel gauge. Same thing, we're gonna take the dash gauge bulb holder out first and start taking the nuts off the back. And if your gauges aren't working, it's more than likely going to be a wiring issue. But most of the time you see these nuts on the back of the gauges. You find these loose, they loosen up over time, so sometimes when you go to retighten these up, they will come back to life. So in our case, we'll be fully disassembling these gauges so we can test them and show you how to test them. I've got these 2 sheet metal style screws and nuts on this side, and then for the ammeter, it's these physical nuts, and those get loosened up like that, and the circuit board will come out and we'll find out what debris is inside. Same thing with this board. We'll check the pins. They all seem to be relatively tight, so we'll be able to reuse this board. Like we previously mentioned, new circuit boards are available through us as well. And if you come to find out your background is kind of faded out on your gauge and you kind of want a new appearance, we won't be installing these in this video, but we have dash gauge decal sets available as well. So same thing with the lens. You're going to want to get your pliers. You may find a better method of doing this. This is just kind of my way of easily doing this without too much damage. Re-bend some of these a little bit further out. There we go. There's the physical lens, and there is a front and back on these. There's a little raised section on the lens itself, and that raised portion goes towards the actual inside of the gauge to stand off the glass. In our case, our glass is kind of scratched and faded and beat up, so we're going to be replacing it. So inside the gauge, you have the back overlay piece that comes right out. And clean that up. Be careful with the lettering. Don't use any solvents. They'll rub right off. And we are left with the physical gauges themselves right here. So these just kind of fall out like that. Be careful with them. And you have the bare housing. So you basically start with a fresh case. So we'll be repeating the process with the temp/oil gauge. Only difference with this gauge being we have the CVR, and the CVR is the constant voltage regulator. This is what supplies the gauges with their nominal low voltage frequency that they need to operate upon under. And if yours is bad, we will be showing you how to test this later in the video. If it's bad, we do offer modern replacements, so you can contact us if you would like us to quote you out on a new CVR as well. So the CVR, this silver thing right here, just comes right out. 2 screws, don't lose it, and then take the dash gauge bulb holder out as well. This is kind of a victim of the loose nut symptom. You see this one's already loose and we haven't even gotten a tool out. That's probably going to cause some accuracy errors within our gauge. So it's always good to go through these and make sure they're good and tight, but we'll be going through that later in the video. So same thing, gonna want to take these nuts out. The circuit board comes right out. Check the pins. Pins are nice and tight, so this is eligible for a reuse on that. And now we're down to the physical gauge lens. Last part. You can see how dirty this one was. Gauge lens, throw that in the discard pile for our case. Back overlay comes out like that. A little musty. We'll be able to clean that up. Fine. And then the gauge pods come right out, and then boom. That is basically the gauge is completely torn apart. So now at this point we will get a little tutorial from Michael on how to test these gauges using a car battery, and we'll figure out if they're good or they're not, and then we'll move on with the cleaning process and the refurb process on what we're specifically doing with this Scout.
My name is Michael. I work at IH Parts America, and today we're going to be testing the CVR and just checking each one to make sure they actually work. What we're gonna need is just a 12-volt battery of some sort, and then some wires, preferably with alligator clips on them. Regular wire if you wanted to, but so with the CVR, first we're gonna test it to see if it actually functions. So we're gonna need the positive side, and on each CVR, it's kind of hidden, but it'll say IGN right there for ignition, and so that's your input side for the power. We're gonna need a voltmeter here, on which this one will just be to 20 volts DC. The negative side clipped on, and then this should be pulsing right around 5 or 6 volts, which if you look at that, it's jumping around here. It's getting up to 5 something, so that means the CVR works. On to testing the actual gauges. Each gauge for the coolant and the oil and the fuel are all essentially the same on how you're going to hook them up. Right side stud, at least when you're looking at the back of it, is your input power, and then the left side is where you're going to get the signal in from your sending unit. So you basically, which I don't know if you can out the other side, which would normally make it move, and that way you can know the gauge works. That one works as well. So amp meter requires some kind of voltage draw, which we actually are going to need a light bulb or something similar to test that, which we currently don't have. But you basically end up needing, so this one, when you look at how it goes in, positive is on the left, negative on the right. You'll have the negative hooked up here, and then a light bulb in series between the power and this side. And when the light bulb energizes, you should see the needle just barely move over. And if it does move when the light bulb is hooked up, then you're good to go. If it doesn't, then that amp meter gauge is defective. So pretty much wraps up our gauge testing. All these gauges are functional for this 1980, and the CVR works. So now we just gotta clean everything up and get it all put back together.
All right, now that we're down to the circuit boards at the state, we'll be showing how to restore them or refurbish them to make them a little bit better for down the road. So you can get yourself a little section of emery cloth or some sandpaper, and you're just going to want to lightly sand all the physical contacts. Basically, everywhere that makes contact with power, you're going to want to sand it just like that. It's a nice clean surface for it, the gauge to physically work a little bit better than what it was doing. So you want to go ahead and get all those surfaces. Same thing with the light. It's not that necessary, but I recommend hitting any oxidized copper surface just real lightly with this piece of sandpaper here. And just like that, contacts are good enough for what we're doing. And have a nice shop rag handy and a thing of alcohol to clean the physical circuit boards just a little bit on the rag itself. Just going to clean the board with that alcohol. Make sure we get any loose grit that was once on here eliminated. So that's one board down. So now we got the next one. Set that off to the side. Same thing. Slightly. You don't want to go crazy. And with the board with the CVR, gotta clean up those extra contacts there as well. Fortunately, these circuit boards were in such good condition. We'll be saving on that. Additionally, if your pegs are actually worn out, sometimes you can fix them back here as well with these little spreaded pieces on the pin itself. Sometimes you can whack those with a little pin and punch and get them solid again. But like I said, if your circuit boards are slightly or remotely cracked or broke or pins are loose, just replace them, because it's not that easy getting all these gauges out time and time again. So now we're down to the speedometer circuit board. I'm just going to touch this up with some alcohol, clean it up nice and well. It doesn't really need any help. Contacts are really nice already, so there's no reason for us to touch it. It already looks like it's been replaced at some point in its life. So good enough for that. Ready for reassembly. So we got all circuit boards are ready and done, and we'll kind of move over to the bulb holders here. If yours are in good condition, you can reuse them. If not, we offer them on our online store. Place the bulbs if needed at the same time. Going through them with some alcohol and clean the dust off of all of them and plan to reuse it. Alright, so that's all those bulbs. Now we'll kind of move on to the cleaning of the housings and the plates. I'll show you how to be safe on those so we don't ruin them in the process. Alright, so you're not going to want to use any alcohol of any kind when you're cleaning up. I guess you can on the housings, but you really want to avoid that on any lettering or anything that's old and original. So we're just going to get some simple green on a rag and take our plate. And we saw earlier, this was full of animal droppings and tree leaves and you name it. That's good enough. Nice and clean, ready to be used again. Sometimes you can just hit the can itself with some simple green as well. so perfect for reassembly. So those parts are clean, the plates are clean. If your plates are rusted up to junk, you can sandblast them or scuff them up. Decal set, ready to go. Always give us a call if you need anything. We're just working with the really nice condition Scout to begin with, so we don't have too much to worry about as far as gauges. They are usually a lot worse. And then the speedometer, we're not going to take it apart. We really have no reason to. You can if you want to. There's cardboard dividers in here that you're gonna have to play with, foam that likes to fall apart. If your speedometer worked fine, just leave it, don't take it apart. So we're just gonna clean it up as we did with the other cans, just kind of get the dust knocked off of it, make it somewhat presentable. And at this time you can shoot some lithium grease on the odometer gear inside the actual speedometer if you'd like to. If yours is lacking any lubrication, it is sometimes nice to do. Nice and clean and ready for reassembly. Alright, now we're in the reassembly phase of this operation. Grab yourself a can and a bezel, and we'll start with the ammeter. Kind of slides in there like that. Already got it backwards actually. Goes in there, don't make the mistake. Fuel goes in like that. We will be installing the physical circuit board itself first. Your circuit board like that, ammeter is positive and negative labeled on there. Be pretty gentle with it, don't hurt the needles or anything like that. And then if you remember, the ammeter had the physical nuts first. Those on, and then you're gonna want to snug them up. Don't go too crazy, just a little bit. If you over tighten it, you will cause issues. Alright, you have to kind of wiggle the circuit board around to kind of get it lined up, and final torquing on that. Alright, and then make sure your fuel gauge is seated. You want to get these decently tight. Sheet metal screw. And tight, I mean snug. Don't strip it out. Just like that. You could put your socket in there for the light currently. At the same time, want to insert your bezel like so. Make sure everything's clean as you like it to be. And then at this point, we're going to be installing the new gauge lens bezel itself. Make sure you don't smudge up the lens that you won't be able to, just like that. And then insert it in the gauge just like you removed it, just like that. Installed. And then to kind of bend the tabs over, a couple different ways of doing it. It's a little bit difficult to do, hurting anything, so you may have to try a couple different tools to see what works best for you, but I usually can eventually get it with a pair of these slip joint pliers here. It's just like that. You just gotta be careful with it. Bend those tabs back over. There we are. There's the amp and fuel gauge ready to be reinstalled. Don't forget the nuts, the ammeter for the wires. Get those pre-installed so you don't forget those or lose them. And we'll be repeating the process for the other two gauges. Alright. There we are. It's done. Wipe off any smudges. Boom. Perfect. Ready to go. So now we're down to the speedometer itself. In this case, we'll set this down gently. Circuit board. We'll put the screws in. So we'll flip it around, and then, as we previously mentioned, we'll be installing the new lens for this as well. There is a back protective piece of masking tape, so make sure you remove that before installing. Outer layer off after we install it, in case we don't nick anything in the process. There's that. There we are, that's all done. Now we just insert our light bulb sockets. Make sure they actually pop in. They're tight. There we go. So all the gauges are done now. Here's the finished look of the gauges. Way better than how we started. So we're gonna get these installed and we'll test them out before we get the gauge panel reinstalled, and we'll go on our day. Alright, and if you remember, we marked all the connectors with marker, make sure we don't mess that up. We go to reinstall. So on some models you can unplug them and plug them in any wrong. Luckily I pulled some speedometer cable out, so it'll be easier to install this time. In my case, I like to leave that hand tight for the next time. They're looking pretty good. Panel on. I want to hook up the, and we'll be testing the instruments to making sure they work still. So turn the key on. So that worked. Turn signal got bumped on. Right side works. So now you've confirmed all of them work, we can go ahead and put the panel back on. So now all we got left is the panel. We're installing a different one than what came out of here. Alright, so there we have the panel installed. Different one than we removed. And we're pretty much done. So if you like this video, let us know if you'd like to see kind of more of this style of content and information on parts and how to install them. This will be the first of this series of kind of tinkery items that most people ask us about, and we figured that we'd make a video on it. So let us know what you think in the comments. Like and subscribe for more future content just like this. Thank you.